Welcome to The Future is Socialist, episode number 6. My name is Emberly McCullough, and I am trying this new Restream.io studio. I hope it works. I don't know if it will, but we shall see. So let's get started. Stop the screen share of that. We're gonna screen share something else real quick. Let me just go up here, fix this. Here we go. All right, we're going to start out with some headlines, some news. But with this, I can show you what it is so you can see as well, so you can join in. Headlines. Suspect in Atlanta spa killings charged with murder amid surge in anti-Asian hate crimes. The House votes to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act, which lapsed under President Trump. Of course it did, because he cares about women. No, he sexually harassed a bunch of women. WHO on AstraZeneca COVID-19 shots. Use of the vaccine far outweighs the risks. Brazil's COVID-19 cases and deaths hit new highs, pushing hospitals to the brink of collapse. And just so you guys know, today I actually got my first of 2 shots for COVID. It was yesterday. It was a bit of a pain in the butt, as some of you may know or may not know. I have cancer, and a little over 5 years ago, I think it's upcoming. No, it has been 5 years ago. Almost 6 years ago, I guess, I had a double mastectomy, so I can't have any punctures in my arms or blood pressure taken out of my arms. So that's where I'm at. But I had my vaccine, and the only side effect so far that I've had is just a sore area around the injection. I had to have it in my leg, and it's like my thigh, my right thigh, and like the whole top of my right thigh is sore. It was worse yesterday. It's got progressively worse yesterday overnight, and then it was pretty bad this morning, but it's starting to recede now. So thankfully, that's happening. The UN reports pandemic has caused 239,000 child and maternal deaths in South Asia. Tanzanian President John Magufuli, who denied COVID-19, dies after rumored coronavirus infection. President Biden says you honor Afghanistan withdrawal agreement. Ugh. How long are we going to be in Afghanistan? Seriously, we've been in there since 2001. When are we going to leave? There are people who were born and have been turned 18 since this war has started, that were born during the Afghanistan war and have turned 18. Too long. Much, much too long. Russia recalls ambassador to U.S. after Biden calls President Putin a killer. U.S. Senate takes up voting rights bill as GOP state lawmakers press voter suppression legislation. The GOP is consistently, and will always try to limit voting rights. They will try to suppress rights anytime they can, at any chance they get. They will do what they have to do. I don't understand. I'm trying to fix the YouTube stream here. I don't know if you guys can see it. Okay. Let me see if I can do this, because I don't know if this is working or not. But you know what? I guess we'll find out later. This is the new system I'm trying. House Democrats reintroduced Medicare for All bill as millions face pandemic without insurance. IRS extending tax deadline to May 17th amid major backlog. Bernie Sanders introduces bill to tax companies with excessive CEO pay. Go Bernie, and I hope that passes. Uber is reclassifying all 70,000 of its UK drivers as workers. Now, why didn't they do that here in the US? I don't understand it. They should have. But no, United States wants to keep the gig work, but gig workers don't have any security. They don't have any real good pay, and they have zero maintenance on their cars. They have to pay for all that. UK to start recording misogyny-driven attacks as hate crimes on opposition mounts to anti-protest bill. Japanese court rules same-sex marriage ban is unconstitutional. All right, go Japan. Federal agents arrest heavily armed man outside residence of VP Kamala Harris. These guys, I tell you, I don't know. I don't know, honestly. Well, those little headlines were a little frightening, but what we're going to talk about today is we're going to once a week, and I believe it's going to be every Thursday, we're going to discuss a woman Marxist. Okay, and today's woman Marxist that we're going to talk about is Catalina Adrianzen. And I hope I said her name right. It's more spelled like Adrianzen, but I think it's said Adrianzen. Okay, so let me get that screen share up so you guys can see that. All right. So today we're going to be discussing just part one, the Woman Question and Marxism. And this is taken from a book by Catalina Adrianzen. Oh, I was going to actually, before we do that, I'm so sorry. I was going to tell you about her. So let me get out of this one and then give you the correct one that I wanted. All right, now that the correct one's on the screen, this is a small biography of Catalina Adrianzen. Catalina Adrianzen was a Peruvian researcher and feminist, founded and led the People's Women's Movement in the central Peruvian Andean city of Huamanga in the 1970s. This movement was tied to the Communist Party of Peru faction that would eventually become known as the Shining Path throughout the 1970s. Adrianzen directed the party's work amongst women. After the Shining Path launched its guerrilla war, which lasted from 1980 until the mid-1990s, Adrianzen directed armed cells in the region of Cusco. In 1982, she was arrested in connection to an incendiary attack on an agricultural cooperative. She was tortured in jail, which left her with emotional scars that led to her internment for several years in psychiatric facilities. She later left Peru and settled into exile in Sweden, where she has worked at university. So she now works at a university. And in 1974, she wrote a book called Marxism, Maritaguay, and the Women's Movement. Okay, more fun. Fun. Not that one. That one. Here we go. Now let's click that so you guys can see what I see. Okay. Marxism, Maritaguay, and the Women's Movement. Catalina Adrianzen. First published in Lima in 1974 by Movimiento Femenino Popular. Translation by the Peru People's Movements. Minor adjustments made to translation by Juan R. Fajardo for the MIA, the Marxist Internet Archive. This edition is up from the Marxist Internet Archive 2006, sourced from the Peru People's Movement. Transcription and markup was done through the Peru People's Movement and Juan R. Fajardo for the MIA. We're going to do section 1 today, the Woman Question and Marxism. The woman question is an important question for the popular struggle, and its importance is greater today because actions are intensifying which tend to mobilize women. a necessary and fruitful mobilization from the working class viewpoint and in the service of the masses of people, but which promoted by and for the benefit of the exploiting classes acts as an element which divides and fetters the people's struggle. In this new period of politicization of the masses of women in which we now evolve, with its base and a greater economic participation by women in the country, it is indispensable to pay serious attention to the woman question as regards study and research, political incorporation, and consistent organizing work. A task which demands keeping in mind Mara Taguai's thesis, which teaches that women, like men, are reactionaries, centrists, or revolutionaries. They cannot, therefore, all fight the same battle side by side. In today's human panorama, class differentiates the individual more than sex. That way, from the beginning, the need to understand the woman question scientifically doubtlessly demands that we start from the Marxist concept of the working class. The theory of women as deficient feminine nature. Through the centuries, the exploiting classes have sustained and imposed the pseudo-theory of the deficient feminine nature that has served to justify the oppression which up to now women experience in societies in which exploitation continues to prevail. That way, the Jewish men's prayer, "Blessed be God, our Lord and Lord of Lords, for not having made me a woman," and conformity by the Jewish women who pray, "Blessed be the Lord who has created me according to his will," clearly express the contempt the ancient world had for the woman's condition. These ideas also predominated in Greek slave society. The famous Pythagoras said, "There is a good principle which has created order, light, and man, and there is a bad principle which has created chaos, darkness, and woman." And even the great philosopher Aristotle pronounced, "The female is female by virtue of certain qualitative fault, and the character of women suffers from a natural defect." Okay, boys. Yeah, okay. These proposals passed on to the final period of Roman slave society and to the Middle Ages, the contempt for woman intensifying in Christian thinkers by imputing her with being the source of sin and the waiting room of hell. Tertullian claimed, Woman, you are the door of the devil. You have persuaded him, whom the devil did not dare to attack frontally. By your fault, the Son of God had to die. You should always go dressed in mourning and rags." And Augustine of Hippona, "The woman is a beast who is neither firm nor stable." While these condemned, others passed sentence on feminine inferiority and obedience. Thus, Paul of Tarsus, the apostle, preached, "Man was not taken from woman, but woman from man." And just as the church is subject to Christ, let woman be submitted in all things to her husband. And hundreds of years later, in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas followed with similar preaching. Man is the head of the woman, just as Christ is the head of the man. And it is the fact that woman is destined to live under the authority of man and that she has no authority by herself. Wow. They really didn't like women, did they? The understanding of the feminine condition did not progress much within the development of capitalism, since while Condorcet pointed out its social root when he said, "It has been said that women lack a sense of justice and that they obeyed their feelings rather than their conscience. That difference has been caused by education and social existence, not by nature." And the great materialist Diderot wrote, "I feel sorry for you women, and in all customs, the cruelty of civil laws joined the cruelty of nature against women. They have been treated as imbeciles." Rousseau, advanced ideologist of the French Revolution, insisted, "All education of women must be relative to that of men. Woman is made to yield to man, and endure his injustices." This bourgeois position is carried on to the age of imperialism, becoming more reactionary as time goes on, which, joined to Christian positions and reiterating old theses sanctioned through John 23, God and nature have given women various chores which perfect and complement the chores entrusted to men. That way, we see how throughout time, the exploiting classes have preached the deficient feminine nature. Sustaining themselves in idealist concepts, they have reiterated the existence of a feminine nature independent of social conditions, which is part of the anti-scientific human nature thesis. But this so-called feminine nature, eternal and invariable essence, is also called deficient, to show that the condition of women and their oppression and patronage is the result of their natural inferiority compared to man. With this pseudo theory, it is intended to maintain and justify the submission of women. Finally, it is convenient to point out that not even an outstanding materialist thinker like Democritus had prejudices with respect to women. A woman familiar with logic, a fearful thing. Woman is much more prone than the male to think evil. and that the defense of women is based in metaphysical or religious arguments. Eve means life and Adam means land. Created after man, woman was finished better than him. Even the bourgeoisie, when it was a revolutionary class, only conceived of women in reference to men, not as independent beings. The development of capitalism and the women's movement. The development of capitalism will incorporate women into labor, providing the basis and conditions for her to develop. That way, with their incorporation into the productive process, women will have the chance of more directly joining the class struggle in combative action. Capitalism carried out the bourgeois revolutions, and in this forge, the feminine masses, especially working women, advanced. The French Revolution, the most advanced one of those led by the bourgeoisie, was a great nourishment for feminist action. Women got mobilized together with the masses, and participating in the civic clubs, they developed revolutionary actions. In these struggles, they organized a society of revolutionary and republican women, and through Olympia de Gauche in 1789, they demanded a declaration of the rights of women and created newspapers like The Impatient to demand improvements in their condition. In the development of the revolutionary process, women won the suppression of the rights of the firstborn male and the abolition of the masculine privileges, and they also obtained equal rights of succession with males and achieved divorce. Their militant participation rendered some fruits. But once the great revolutionary push was halted, women were denied access to the political clubs. Their politicization was suppressed, and they saw themselves blamed and urged to return to the home. They were told, "Since when have women been allowed to renounce their sex and become men? Nature has told woman, be a woman. Your chores are to tend to infants, the details of the home, and the diverse challenges of motherhood." Even more, with bourgeois reorganization initiated by Napoleon with the Civil Code, a married woman returned to be a subject to patronage. Falling under her husband's domain in her person and goods, she is denied the questioning of paternity. Married women, like prostitutes, lose their civil rights, and they are denied divorce and the right to transfer their properties. In the French Revolution, we can already see clearly how the advance of women and their setbacks are linked to the advances and setbacks of the people and the revolution. This is an important lesson, the identity of interests of the feminist movement and the people's struggle, how the former is part of the latter. Also, this bourgeois revolution shows how the ideas about women follow a process similar to the political process. Once the revolutionary upsurge was fought and halted, reactionary ideas reemerged about women. Bonald maintained, man is to woman as woman is to child. Comte, considered the father of sociology, proposed that femininity is a sort of continued infancy, and that this biological infancy is expressed as intellectual weakness. Balzac wrote, "The destiny of women and their only glory is to make the hearts of men beat. The woman is a property acquired by contract, a mobile, personal property, because the possession is worth a title in all. Speaking properly, woman is but an annex to man." All this reactionary ideology is synthesized in the following words by Napoleon. "Nature wanted for women to be our slaves. They are our property. Woman is but a machine to produce children, a character for whom feminine life should be oriented by kitchen, church, children." A slogan endorsed by Hitler in this century. The French Revolution raised its three principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity and promised justice and to meet the demands of the people. Very soon it showed its limits and that its principal declarations were but formal declarations. At the same time, its class interests were counterpoised to those of the masses. Misery, hunger, and injustice kept on prevailing, except under new forms. Against such an order of things, the utopians launched themselves with a sharp and demolishing criticism, although due to historic conditions, they could not reach the root of evil. Utopian socialists also condemned the condition of women under capitalism. Fourier, representing this position, pointed out the change of an historical age can always be determined by the progress of women. The degree of emancipation of woman constitutes the natural path for general emancipation. Confronted with this great assertion, it's worth counterposing the thought of the anarchist Proudhon about women, and keep in mind his ideas when there are attempts today to propagate anarchism to the four winds, presenting them as examples of revolutionary vision and consequence. Proudhon maintained that woman was inferior to man physically, intellectually, and morally, and that represented together numerically, women have a value of 8/27th the value of man. So for this hero, a woman represents less than a third of the value of a man, which is but an expression of the petty bourgeois thought of its author, a root common to all anarchists. Throughout the 19th century, with their increasing incorporation into productive processes, into the productive process, women continued to develop their struggle for their own demands, joining the workers' unions and revolutionary movements of the proletariat. An example of this participation was Louisa Michel, a fighter at the Paris Commune of 1871. But the feminist movement in general oriented itself towards suffragism, to the struggle to get the right to vote for women, in pursuit of the false idea that in getting the vote and parliamentary positions, their rights would be respected. That way, feminist actions were channeled towards parliamentary cretinism. However, it's good to remember that the vote was not achieved for free, but that during the last century and the start of this century, women fought openly and determinedly to get it. The struggle for the feminine vote and its achievement show once more that, while this indeed was a conquest, it is not the means allowing a genuine transformation of the condition of women. The 20th century implies a greater development of the feminist economic action. Women workers increase massively, as well as women employees, to whom are added strong contingents of professionals. Women enter into all fields of activity. In this process, world wars have great importance because they incorporated millions of women into the economy to substitute for the men mobilized to the front. All this pushed the mobilization, organization, and politicization of women. Starting from the 1950s, the feminist struggle starts again with greater force, amplified in the 1960s with great perspectives for the future. In conclusion, through the economic incorporation of women, capitalism set the basis for their economic autonomy. But capitalism by itself is not capable of giving formal legal equality to women. In no way can it emancipate them. This has been proven throughout the history of the bourgeoisie, a class which, even in its most advanced revolution, the French Revolution of the 18th century, could not go further than a merely formal declaration of rights. Further on, the latter development of the bourgeois revolutionary processes in the 20th century show not only that the bourgeoisie is incapable of emancipating the masses of women, but with the development of imperialism, the bourgeois concept as regards the feminine condition becomes more reactionary as time goes on, and in fact confirms the social, economic, political, and ideological oppression of women, even if it disguises and paints it in myriad ways. Marxism and the emancipation of women. Marxism, the ideology of the working class, conceives the human being as a set of social relations that change as a function of the social process. Thus, Marxism is absolutely opposed to the thesis of human nature as an internal, immutable reality outside the frame of social conditions. This thesis belongs to idealism in reaction. The Marxist position also implies the overcoming of mechanical materialism, of the old materialists before Marx and Engels, who were incapable of understanding the historical social character of the human being as a transformer of reality. So irrationally, it had to rely on metaphysical or spiritual conditions, such as the case of Feuerbach. Just as Marxism considers the human being as a concrete reality historically generated by society, it does not accept either the thesis of feminine nature, which is but a complement of the so-called human nature, and therefore a reiteration that woman has an eternal and unchanging nature, aggravated, as we saw, because what idealism and reaction understand by feminine nature is a deficient and an inferior nature compared to man. For Marxism, women, as much as men, are but a set of social relations, historically adapted and changing as a function of the changes of society in its development process. Woman, then, is a special product, and her transformation demands the transformation of society. When Marxism focuses on the woman question, therefore, it does so from a materialist and dialectical viewpoint, from a scientific conception, which indeed allows a complete understanding. In the study, research, and understanding of women and their condition, Marxism treats the woman question with respect to property, family, and state. Since throughout history, the condition and historical place of women is intimately linked to those three factors. An extraordinary example of concrete analysis of the woman question from this viewpoint is seen in Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State by Friedrich Engels, who, pointing to the substitution of mother right by father right as the start of the submission of women, wrote, "Thus, the riches, as they went on increasing, on one hand provided man with a more important position than woman in the family, and on the other planted in him the idea of taking advantage of this importance to modify the established order of inheritance for the benefit of his children. That revolution, one of the most profound humanity has known, had no need to touch even one of the living members of the gens. All its members could go on being what they had been up to then. It merely sufficed to say that in the future, the descendants of the male line would remain in the gens, but those of the female line would leave it, going to the gens of their father. The way maternal affiliation and inheritance by mother right were abolished, replaced by masculine affiliation and inheritance by father right. We know nothing of how this revolution took place in the cultured peoples since it took place in prehistoric times. The overthrowing of mother right was the great historic defeat of the female sex throughout the world. Man also grabbed the reins of the house. Woman saw herself degraded, turned into a servant, into the slave of man's lasciviousness, as a mere instrument of reproduction. This paragraph by Engels sets the fundamental thesis of Marxism about the woman question. The question of women is sustained in property relations, in the form of ownership exercised over the means of production and in the relative productive relations arising from them. This thesis of Marxism is extremely important because it establishes that the oppression attached to the female condition has as its roots the formation, appearance, and development of the right to ownership over the means of production, and therefore that its emancipation is linked to the destruction of said right. It is indispensable in order to have a Marxist understanding of the woman question to start from this great thesis. And more than ever today, when supposed revolutionaries and even self-proclaimed Marxists pretend to have feminine oppression arising not from the formation and appearance of private property, but from the simple division of labor as a function of sex, which had attributed less important chores to women than those of men, reducing her to the sphere of the home. This proposal, despite all the propaganda and efforts to present it as revolutionary, is but the substitution for the Marxist position on the emancipation of women, with bourgeois proposals which in essence are but variations of the supposed immutable feminine nature. Developing this materialist dialectical starting point, Engels teaches how, on this basis, the monogamous family was instituted, about which he says, it was the first form of family not based on natural, but on economic conditions, and concretely on the triumph of private property over spontaneously originated common primitive property. And therefore, monogamy in no way appears in history as a reconciliation between man and woman, and even less as a higher form of marriage. Quite the contrary, it enters the scene under the form of the enslavement of one sex by the other, as the proclamation of a war between the sexes, up to then unknown in prehistory. After establishing that private property sustains the monogamous family form, which sanctions the oppression of women, Engels establishes the correspondence of the three fundamental forms of marriage with the three great stages of human evolution: savagery and marriage by groups, barbarism and pairing marriage, civilization and monogamy, with its complements, adultery and prostitution. That way, the Marxist classics developed the thesis about historically variable social condition of woman and her place in society, pointing out how the feminine condition is intimately linked with private property, the family, and the state, which is the apparatus that legalizes such relations and imposes and sustains them by force. How are we doing? Good. Got one person watching. Sorry, guys. I'm having a little bit of a tummy issue. This scientific proposition, systemized by Engels, is a product of the Marxist analysis of the condition of women throughout history. And the most elementary study fully corroborates the accuracy and actuality of these proposals, which are the foundation and starting point of the working class for the understanding of the woman question. Let's make an historical recount, allowing us to illustrate what Engels and the classics set forth. In the primitive community, with the natural division of labor based on age and sex, men and women developed their lives on the spontaneous equality and participation of women in social group decisions. Later on, women were surrounded with respect and consideration, a deferential and even privileged treatment. Once riches began to grow, which heightened the position of men in the family, pushing forward the substitution of father right for mother right, women began to move to the background and their position deteriorated. Echoes of this reached the times of the great Greek tragic Aeschylus, who in his work Eumenida wrote, "It is not mother who engenders that which is called her son. She is only the nurse of the embryo deposited in her womb. Who engenders is the father. The woman receives the seed as a foreign depository, and she preserves it if so pleases the gods." Thus, in Greek slave society, the condition of women is that of submission, social inferiority, and object of contempt. Of them, it is said, the slave absolutely lacks of the freedom to deliberate. Woman has it, but in a weak and inefficient manner, Aristotle. The best woman is that of whom men speak the least, Pericles. And the answer by the husband who investigates public affairs, it's not your thing. Shut up lest I hit you. Keep on weaving. Aristophanes, Lysistrata. What reality is entailed by these words? Women in Greece were kept as perpetual minor, under the power of their tutor, whether their father, the husband's heir, or the state. Their lives passed under constant tutelage. They were provided a marriage dowry, so they had something on which to live and did not go hungry. Sorry, guys, my puppy's barking. All right, Patrick, enough. They provided a marriage dowry, so they had something on which to live and did not go hungry. And in some cases, they were authorized to divorce. For the rest, they were reduced to misogynism in the home and in society under the control of specialized authorities. Women could inherit when there was no direct male heir, in which case she had to marry the oldest relative within the paternal generations. That way she would not inherit directly, but was merely a transferer of inheritance, all to preserve the family property. The condition of women in Rome, also a slave society, allows a better understanding of it as derived from property, the family, and state. After the reign of Tarquinius, and once patriarchal right was set up, private property and therefore the family generations became the basis of society. Women will remain subject to patrimony and the family. She was excluded from every virile job, and in public relation affairs, she was a civil minor. She is not directly denied inheritance, but is subject to tutelage. On this point, said Gaius, the Roman jurist, tutelage was established in the interest of the tutors themselves, so the women of whom they are supposed heirs cannot wrest their willed inheritance from them, nor impoverish it by alienation or debts. The patrimonial root of the tutelage imposed upon women was therefore clearly exposed and established. After the 12 tables, the fact that women belonged to the paternal generations and to the conjugal generations, also strictly for reasons of safeguarding property, generated conflicts which were the basis for the advancement of the Roman legal emancipation. Sine manu marriage appears. Her goods remain dependent on her tutors, and her husband only acquires rights over her person, and at that shared with the pater familias, who retains an absolute authority over his daughter. And the domestic tribunal appears to resolve discrepancies which may arise between father and husband. The way the woman can appeal to her father for disagreements with her husband and vice versa. It no longer is the matter of the individual. On this economic basis, her participation in the inheritance, even if tutored, and the conflict between the rights of the paternal and conjugal gens for the woman and her goods, a major participation of Roman women in their society develops despite the legal restrictions. The atrium is set up, the center of the house, which governs work by the slaves, conducts education of the children, and influences them until a rather advanced age. She shares the works and problems of her spouse and is considered co-proprietor of his goods. She attends parties, and on the street she is given preferential crossing even by consuls and magistrates. The weight of Roman women in their society is reflected by the figure of Cornelia, mother of Gracchi. With Roman social development, the state displaces the contention among the gens and assumes the generations and assumes the disputes about women, divorce, adultery, etc., which went to be heard in public tribunals, abolishing the domestic tribunal. Later on, under imperial rule, tutelage on women will be abolished, answering to social and economic demands. Women get a fixed dowry, individual patrimony, which does not return to the agnates, parental relatives, nor belongs to the husband. That way, she is given an economic base for her independence and development. By the end of the Republic, mothers had been given recognized rights over their children, receiving custody of them due to their father's misconduct or his being placed under tutelage. Under Emperor Marcus Aurelius in the year 178, a great step is taken in the process of property and family. Children are declared heir to their mother in preference to agnates. That way, the family is based on a link of consanguinity, and the mother emerges as equal to the father before the children. The children are also are recognized as children of the wife, and derived from the above, the daughter inherits just as her male siblings. But while the state emancipates women from the family, it submits them to its tutelage and restricts their acts. And simultaneously to the social rise of women, anti-feminist campaign was initiated in Rome, invoking their inferiority and invoking their imbecility and fragility of the sex to legally reduce them. In Rome, then, socially, women had it better than in Greece and acquired respect and even great influence in social life, as shown by the words of Cato. Everywhere men govern women, and we, who govern all men, are governed by our women. Roman history has outstanding, exalted women from the Sabines through Lucretia and Virginia to Cornelia. Criticisms of women, not as women but as contemporaries, developed by the end of the 1st and 2nd centuries of our era. In this way, Juvenal reproaches them, lasciviousness, gluttony, to dedicate themselves to manly occupations and their passion for hunting and sports. Roman society recognized some rights of women, especially the right to property, but did not open them to civil activities and much less public affairs, activities which they developed illegally and in a restricted way. For that reason, Roman matrons, having lost their ancient virtues, tended to seek other fields in which to employ their energies. In the decline of slavery and the development of feudalism, to consider the feminine situation, one must keep in mind the influence of Christianity and the Germanic contribution. Christianity contributed quite a bit to the oppression of women. Among the fathers of the church, there is a definite demeaning of women, whom they consider inferior, servants of men and sources of evil. To what has been said, let's add the condemnation by St. John Chrysostomus, a saint of the Catholic Church. No savage beast is as damaging as woman. Under this influence, the advances reached under Roman legislation are at first mitigated and later on denied. Germanic societies based on war gave women a secondary situation due to their smaller physical strength. However, they were respected and had rights which made them an associate of their spouse. Let's remember that on this subject, Tacitus wrote, "In peace and in war she shares his luck. She lives with him and dies with him." Christianity and Germanicism influenced the condition of women under feudalism. Women were in a situation of absolute dependence with respect to the father and husband. By the times of King Clovis, the mundium weighs over her during all her life. Women developed their lives completely submitted to the feudal lord. Although protected by the laws as property of man and mother of children, her value increases with fertility, being worth triple the value of a free man, a value she loses when she can no longer bear offspring. Woman is a reproductive womb. As happened in Rome, also under feudalism, we see an evolution in the condition of women in function of the curbing of feudal powers and the increase of royal powers. The mundium is transferred from the lords to the king. The mundium becomes a burden for the tutor, yet the submission by tutelage is kept. At the convulsive times when feudalism was formed on the condition of women was uncertain, since the rights to sovereignty and property, public and private, were not well specified. The condition of women was changing and heightened or lowered according to social contingencies. First, they were denied private rights because women had no public rights. Until the 11th century, force and arms impose order and sustain property directly. To juris, a fiefdom is in land possessed with charge of military service, and women could not have feudal rights since they could not defend it with arms nor render military service. When fiefdoms turn into patrimonies and are inheritable according to Germanic norms, women could also inherit. Feminine succession is admitted, but this does not improve their condition. Woman is just an instrument through whom dominion is transferred, as in Greece. Feudal property is not familial, as in Rome, but of the sovereign, of the Lord, and women too belong to the Lord. It is to him who chooses her husband. As it is written, an heiress is a land and a castle. Suitors contended to dispute that prize, and often the young woman is only 12 years old or younger when her father or lord gives her as a prize to any baron. The woman needs a lord who protects her and her rights. Thus, a Duchess of Burgundy proclaimed to the king, "My husband has just died, but what good is mourning? Find me a husband who is powerful, because I much need him to defend my lands." In this form, her spouse had great marital power over the woman, whom he treated without consideration, mistreating her, beating her, etc., and whose only obligation was to punish her reasonably, the same some codes required today to correct children. The prevailing warlike conception made the medieval knight pay more attention to his horses than to his wife, and the lords preached, "Damned be the knight that seeks advice from a woman when he should participate in a tourney," while women were commanded, "Get into your apartments, painted and gilded, sit in the shade, drink, eat, weave, tint the silk, but bother not of our affairs. Our affairs are to fight with sword and seal. Silence!" That is how the medieval world of the lords demeaned and cast their women away. The 13th century saw the development development of a movement of literary women, which traveling from south to north increased their prestige, the same one which was linked to chivalry, love, and the intense Marianism of that era. It did not modify it deeply, as S. de Beauvoir said in The Second Sex, a book in which abundant information about the history of women is found. Useful data, of course, aside from the existentialist concepts of its authors, since it's not ideas which fundamentally change the condition of women, but the economic basis sustaining it. When the fiefdom goes from from a right based on military service to an economic obligation, we see an improvement in the condition of women, since they are perfectly capable of fulfilling a monetary obligation, the way the seigneurial right to marry his vassals is suppressed and women's tutelage is extinguished. In this way, whether single or widowed, women have the same rights as men. In possessing a fiefdom, she governs it and fulfills its administrative duties, and even commands its defense, participating in battles. But feudal society, like all those based on exploitation, requires the submission of women in marriage, and marital power survives. The husband is the tutor of the wife, is preached, or as Beauvoir said, as soon as marriage was consummated, the goods of one and the other are commonly by virtue of the marriage, justifying marital tutelage. In feudal society, as in others, ruled by exploiters, slavery, or capitalism, what has been described about the condition of women has governed and governs. But we must highlight that only in the condition of poor women can we see a different and softer condition in the face of marital power. The root of this situation must be seen in the economic participation by women of the popular classes and in the absence of great riches. The development of capitalism takes feudalism to its decomposition. Oh, no more tea. Now on to water. It suffices to emphasize that in the beginning and development of the burghs, women took part in the election of deputies to the general states, which shows feminine political participation as well as the existence of rights over family goods, since the husband could not alienate real properties without the consent of the wife. However, absolutist legislation will soon fetter these norms to fight off the diffusion of the bad bourgeois example. This historical exposition exemplifies the thesis by Ingalls and the classics on the social roots of the condition of women and its relationship to property, family, and state. It helps us to understand its certainty and see its actuality more clearly. All this carries us to a conclusion: the need to firmly adhere to the working class positions and apply them to understand the woman question, participate in its solution, and reject constantly and decisively the distortions of Marxist thesis on the subject and on the so-called superior developments, which are but attempts to substitute bourgeois ideas for proletarian concepts on this front to disorient the women's movement on the march. Having exposed the social condition of women and the historical outline of its development linked to property, family, and state, what remains is to treat the question of women's emancipation from a Marxist viewpoint. Marxism fundamentally holds that the development of machinery incorporates women as well as children into the productive process, thereby multiplying the number of hands to be exploited, destroying the working class family, physically degenerating women, and materially and morally sinking them into the miseries of exploitation. Analyzing women and children at work, Karl Marx wrote, "Insofar as machines with muscular power, it becomes a means of employing laborers of slight muscular strength and those whose bodily development is incomplete, but whose limbs are all the more supple. The labor of women and children was, therefore, the first cry of the capitalist application of machinery. That mighty substitute for labor and laborers was forthwith changed into a means for increasing the number of wage laborers by enrolling under the direct sway of capital every member of the woman's family without distinction of age or sex. Compulsory work for the capitalists usurped the place not only of the children's play, but also of free labor at home within moderate limits for the support of the family. The value of labor power was determined not only by labor time necessary to maintain the individual adult laborer, but also by that necessary to maintain his family. Machinery, by throwing every member of that family onto the labor market, spreads the values of the man's labor power over his whole family. It thus depreciates his labor power. Thus we see that machinery, while augmenting the human material that forms the principal object of capital's exploiting power, at the same time raises the degree of exploitation." By opening the factory doors to women and children, making them flock in great numbers to the combined ranks of the working class, machinery finally breaks down the resistance of the male worker to this, despite the despotism of capital within manufacturing. Capital Volume 1. Continuing his masterful analysis, Marx himself describes to us how capitalism uses even the virtues and obligations of women for its advantage. Mr. E, manufacturer, told me how in his textile mills he employed exclusively women, preferably married ones, and above all those who had at home a family living from or depending on her salary, since these were much more active and zealous than single women. Besides, the need to procure sustenance to their families forced them to work harder. In this way, the virtues characterizing women are turned against them. All the purity and sweetness of their character are turned into instruments of torture and slavery. But just as by incorporating women into production, capitalism increased exploitation, simultaneously within this process, it provides the material basis for women to struggle and demand their rights, and it's a starting point for the struggle of their emancipation. Since, as Engels taught in Origin, the freeing of women demands, as a first condition, the reincorporation of the entire female sex into social industry, which in turn requires that the individual family no longer be society's economic unit. And evidently, capitalism, with its own future interests, set the basis for the future emancipation of women, as well as creating the class that will destroy it as it develops, the proletariat. On the other hand, their economic participation in the development of the class struggle pushes forward the politicization of women. I have a hard time with that word. We already highlighted how the French Revolution pushed forward the political and organizational development of women, and how by uniting them, mobilizing them, and forcing them to fight, it set the basis for the feminist movement. However, with all the positive aspects that the incorporation of women into the French Revolution had, the resulting politicization of women was but elementary, restricted, and very small compared to the major advance represented by the politicization of women by the working classes. What does this politicization imply? When capitalism massively incorporates women into the economic process, it wrests them away from inside of the home to attract them mostly to factory exploitation, making industrial workers out of them. That way, women are forged and developed as an integral part of the most advanced and latest class in history. Women initiate their radical process of politicization through their incorporation into the workers' union struggle. The great change implied by this is observed concretely in our country by the transformation seen in women workers, peasants, and teachers of Peru amidst the union struggle. A woman arrives at more advanced forms of organization, which goes on building her up and shaping her ideologically for the proletarian concepts. And finally, she arrives at superior forms of struggle and political organization by incorporating herself through her best representatives into the ranks of the party of the working class, to serve the people in all forms and fronts of struggle, organized and led by the working class through its political vanguard. This politicization process, which only the proletariat is capable of producing, and the new type of women fighters it generates, has materialized in the many glorious women fighters whose names are recorded in history. Louisa Michel, N. Krupskaya, Rosa Luxemburg, Li Julan, and others whose memory the people and the proletariat keep. For Marxism, yesterday, like today, the politicization of women is the key issue in her emancipation, and the classics dedicated special attention to it. Marx thought, anyone who knows something of history knows that the great social changes are impossible without the feminist ferment. Social progress can be measured exactly by the social position of the weak sex. Letter to Kugelman, 1888. And to Lenin, the participation of women was more urgent and important to the revolution. The experience of all the liberation movements confirms that the success of the revolution depends on the degree in which women participate. Thus, the development of the class struggle and its ever greater sharpening within the specific social conditions of the revolutionary struggle under conditions of imperialism sets forth and demands more decisively the politicization of women. That is why Lenin himself, in the middle of World War I and foreseeing future battles for the working class which required preparedness, called to fight for 17, abolition of any and all limitations without exception to the political rights of women in comparison to men, explaining to the masses of the special urgency of this transformation at moments in which the war and scarcity disquiet the masses of people and awaken interest in and attention to politics and arm them for the struggle. Politics, particularly among women, he proposed, it is necessary that we fully develop systematic work among these feminine masses. We must educate these women who have managed to wrest away from passivity. We must recruit them and arm them for the struggle, not just the proletarian women who work in the factories or toil in the home, but also the peasant women, the women in the various layers of the petty bourgeois. They too are victims of capitalism. With these words, Lenin demanded the politicization of women, the struggle for demanding their political rights, the need to explain to the masses the urgency of politically incorporating women, the need of working together with them to educate them, organize them, and prepare them for all forms of struggle. Finally, he emphasized orienting themselves towards working women, but without forgetting the importance of peasant women and remembering the various classes or layers of women being exploited, since all of them could and should be mobilized for the people's struggle. From the above, we see how the politicization of women was proposed by Marxism from its beginnings. Considering women's struggles as being in solidarity with the struggles of the working class, this is why last century, Bebel said that woman and the worker have in common their condition as oppressed, and why the Socialist Congress of 1879 proclaimed the equality of the sexes and the need to struggle for it, reiterating the solidarity of the revolutionary feminist women and the working class struggle, or as China proclaims today following Mao Zedong's thesis, the emancipation of women is an integral part of the liberation of the proletariat. This brings us to consider, how can the emancipation of women be achieved? Investigating capitalist society and societies in general where exploitation and oppression prevail, Engels verified that misery, inequality, and submission exist among men, and emphasizing the woman question, he pointed out, the state of affairs with respect to the equality of men and women is no better than their legal inequality, which we have inherited from prior social conditions, is not the cause but the effect of the economic oppression of women. And he continued, women cannot be emancipated unless they assume a large, socially measurable role in production and are only tied insignificantly by domestic work. And this has only been possible with modern industry, which not only admits feminine labor in a large scale, but fatally demands it. This assertion by Engels, taken out of context and unrelated to similar ones from origin, helps some people, pseudo-Marxists and distorters of Marxism, stretching his ideas to claim that the mere participation of women in the economic process is sufficient for their emancipation. Engels proposed that the incorporation of women into production was a condition, that is the base upon which women act in favor of their emancipation, and that this demands to socially and domestic work which absorbs and annihilates women, which to Engels implies destroying private ownership of the means of production and developing large-scale production based on the social ownership of the productive means. We repeat that it is good to be very clear about this thesis by Engels, because today some attempt to hide themselves in this classic, to distort the Marxist position on the woman question and preach for the sake of exploiting classes on the plain and simple participation of women in the economic process, hiding the root of women's oppression, which is private ownership, and sidestepping large-scale social production based on destroying private property of the means of production. Foreseeing this distortion, as in other cases, the classics analyzed the problem of whether the incorporation of women to the productive class process, which capitalism began, was capable of making men and women truly equal. The concise and powerful answer was given once more by Mao Zedong in the 1950s. True equality between men and women can only be achieved in the process of the socialist transformation of the whole of society. Excuse me. Lenin researched the situation of women in bourgeois society and compared it with how it was under the dictatorship of the proletariat, an analysis which led him to establish, from remote times, the representatives of all the movements of liberation in Western Europe, not for decades, but during centuries, proposed the abolition of these antiquated laws and demanded the legal equality of women and men, but no democratic European state, not even the most advanced republics, have managed to achieve this, because wherever capitalism exists, wherever private ownership of the factories is maintained, wherever the power of capital is maintained, men go on enjoying privileges. From the first months of its existence, Soviet power, as the power of workers, realized the most divisive and radical legislative change with respect to women. In the Soviet Republic, no stone was left unturned, which kept women in a position of dependence. I am referring precisely to those laws which use the dependent situation of women in a special way, making her victim of the inequality of rights and often even of humiliations. That is to say, laws on divorce, on natural children, and on the right of women to sue the father in court to support the child. Tasks of the women workers in the Soviet Republic. From this comparative analysis, the conclusion is taken that not only the revolution, which places the working class in power in alliance with the peasantry, is capable of sanctioning the true judicial legal equality between men and women, and even further of enforcing it. However, as Lenin himself taught, this true legal equality initiated by the revolution is but the beginning of a protracted struggle for the full and complete equality in life of men and women. However, the more we rid ourselves of the burden of old bourgeois laws and institutions, the more clearly we see that we have barely cleared the terrain for construction, yet construction itself has not begun. The woman continues to be a slave of the home despite all the liberating laws because she is overburdened, oppressed, stupefied, humiliated by the menial domestic tasks which make her a cook and a nurse, which waste her activity in an absurdly unproductive, menial, irritating, stupefying, and tedious labor. The phrase emancipation of women will only begin for real in the country at the time the mass struggle begins, led by the proletariat already owning the power of the state against the petty home economy, or more precisely, when their mass transformation begins in a large-scale socialist economy, a great initiative. Thus, Lenin and Mao Zedong answered the anticipated opportunist distortions and pseudo-developments of Marxism, which today attempts to distort the theses of Engels and confuse the working class position on the woman question. Marxism conceives the struggle for the emancipation of women as a protracted but victorious struggle. This is a protracted struggle, which requires a radical transformation on the social technique and of customs. But this struggle will end with the full victory of communism. The above, in essence, shows there is an identity of struggle between the revolutionary feminist movement and the working class struggle for the construction of a new society. And besides, it helps to understand the sense of Lenin's words calling women workers to develop the institutions and means which the revolution placed at their disposal. We say that the emancipation of workers must be the work of the workers themselves, and likewise, the emancipation of women workers must be the work of women workers themselves. These are the central theses on Marxism on the These are the central theses of Marxism on the emancipation, politicization, and the condition of women, positions which we prefer to transcribe by quotations from the classics, because these positions are not sufficiently known, and besides that, because they were masterfully and concisely expressed by the authors themselves, which relieves us from the task of pretending to give them new editing, more so after seeing their full and complete actuality. On the other hand, the distortions of the Marxist positions attempted today on the woman question also demand the dissemination of the words of the classics themselves. Finally, it is indispensable, even if only in passing, to make note that Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Mao set forth the thesis on the emancipation of women and not that of women's liberation, as can be appreciated from the side quotations. On this particular, it suffices to say that the analysis of the condition of women through history shows her as a subject to tutelage and in a situation of submission with respect to the male, which makes women a being who, while belonging to the same class as her husband or the man she has a relationship with, finds herself in a situation of inferiority with respect to him, an inferiority which the laws bless, sanctify, and impose. Consistent with this situation of undervaluing throughout history, we see the need to demand her rights to achieve formal equality with man under capitalism, and how only the revolutionary struggle under the leadership of the proletariat is capable of setting up and fulfilling a genuine legal equality of men and women. Though, as we saw, plentiful equality in life, as Lenin said, will develop as large-scale socialist production develops. These simple observations show the certainty of the thesis on women's emancipation conceived as part of the liberation of the proletariat. While the thesis of women's liberation historically surfaces as a bourgeois thesis, hidden at the bottom of which is the counterposing counterpoising of men and women due to sex and camouflaging the root of the oppression of women. Today, we see how women's liberation is exposed more each day as bourgeois feminism, which aims at dividing the people's movement by separating the feminine masses from it and seeking mainly to oppose the development of the women's movement under the leadership and guide of the working class. We are not going to go into this section, Maritaguay and the woman question. That'll be for another day. And then there's a section 3 called Developing the Feminist Movement following Maria Taguay. So there's 2 more sections on this, but we're going to stop there. Go back here. And we're back. How are we doing, everyone? I'm so glad to see some people joined the stream today. Every day at 4, we will be doing this. So all right, guys, that's the end of today's show. The Future is Socialist. So this was episode number 6. We'll be back again tomorrow at 4 o'clock and Saturday at 4 o'clock, Sunday at 4 o'clock, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, every day at 4 o'clock. Okay, guys? All right. Have a good one. See you tomorrow.